Fear and Trembling by Soren Kierkegaard is in the form of a deep and multi-layered analysis of Abraham's story as told in Genesis, where God commands Abraham to take his son Isaac to Mount Moriah and to kill him as a sacrifice. Abraham silently does as he is told without any questioning. He takes his son to the mountain and it takes them 3 days to get to the exact spot that God chose for the offering. Abraham clenches his knife, and just in the nick of the time an angel appears to Abraham, an angel that God sent, and he tells Abraham to sacrifice a ram instead of his son. Fear and trembling is essential to understanding what is termed as Christian existentialism, together with a number of concepts that have become connected with Kierkegaard, like repetition, double movement, the night of faith, the leap of faith, and teleological suspension. The book is split into these sections. The preface, Exordium, Eulogy on Abraham, Problema III, Expectoration, Problema I, Problema II, Problema III, and an epilogue. In the preface, we are introduced to Kierkegaard's surrogate author, and his name is Johannes di Silentio. Kierkegaard customarily writes under nicknames, and in this preface he permits his surrogate author to converse with the reader. Johannes di Silentio tells us that he is no philosopher. What he means is that he doesn't follow the dominant argumentative philosophical method of the period, which is Hegelian dialectics. The Hegelian method that Di Silentio is at odds with is a well-oiled system. It starts with doubt, then it opposes a thesis to an antithesis in order to reach a synthesis. In this system, reason is primordial and faith is abhorred for its indefensibility by reason. Di Silentio doesn't agree with any of that. He says that doubt is not a given, it's not a starting point. He describes how Descartes didn't reach doubt until he renounced everything, including his own corporeality. Ancient Greek and Roman skeptic schools of philosophy went through rigorous asceticism to arrive at doubt and concluded with doubt that nothing really exists, and that even if something existed, it wouldn't be possible for us to know about it. And even if we did get a sense of what really exists, we wouldn't be able to refer to it. All this is different from using doubt as a starting point. Di Silentio criticizes Hegel's idea of the absolute mind, which Hegel presents as the purest appreciation of the truth, and that he elevates as superior to what is aesthetic and to what is based on faith. Di Silentio condemns the supposed inferiority of faith to reason, and would later expand on that on the forthcoming sections. He tells us that he doesn't expect his book to draw any critical acclaim. If anything, it is a book that will probably be abhorred, and he warns against looking at it through the lenses of the philosophical paradigm of which the book is precisely critical. And he was right. He was right about that. The interest in Kierkegaard's work wouldn't flare until after his death. In Exordium, Johannes tells us about a man who's very much interested in the story of Abraham. He says that he has always loved Abraham's story, but confesses that as he grows older, he finds it more difficult to make sense of it. What interests him is the psychology of Abraham and his state of mind when he was asked by God to kill his son, and while he was taking his son to the mountain to kill him. The pondering man envisages 4 possibilities, and he uses the analogy with a mother who has to wean her child. Evidently, having to kill one's son is different from having to wean him, but the analogy proves to be successful in explicating the possible states of mind that Abraham might have been in. So first scenario, Abraham tells Isaac that he has to take him to the mountain to kill him. He presents the killing as if it were Abraham's decision. This way, he tells his son what is going to happen, but he doesn't tell him that it was God who decreed it. This way, Abraham shields his son from renouncing God, and Abraham shoulders all the blame in the eyes of his son. Second scenario, Abraham does what he is told, but harbors resentment for God. He doesn't voice any of it, but his faith is forever shaken. In this situation, Abraham starts to question whether God is benevolent or malevolent. Abraham does what he is told, but his compliance is entirely out of fear. Third scenario, Abraham thinks that God wants him to supplicate to spare his son death. He heads towards the mountain alone, not accompanied by his son, with the intention of begging and imploring God to save his son. Fourth scenario, Abraham takes Isaac to the mountain, and just as Abraham holds the knife and is about to kill Isaac, Isaac panics and loses his faith. In the Exordium, Johannes shows how hard it is to use reason to understand Abraham's decision and actions. The four possibilities that the pondering man lays down attempt to rationalize Abraham's actions and state of mind. But none of these suggested scenarios prove to be satisfactory because they're not consistent with what we know of Abraham as the father of faith. Johannes comments that a failure to understand Abraham's actions, state of mind, and composure stems from a confusion of what is ethical and what is religious. Only by differentiating between the two can we get a better appreciation of Abraham's actions and state of mind. Note that in either or, Kierkegaard opposes the aesthetic to the ethical, and in Fear and Trembling, he is introducing a new mode, the religious. Johannes proposes a hierarchy that starts with the aesthetic, followed by the ethical, and topped by the religious. You notice that the aesthetic is the lowest order, and the religious is the highest. He defines the aesthetic as the subjective experience of pleasure. It is achievable through the senses. It can range from animalistic gratification of hunger or sex to the marvel at a painting or a piece of music, which Kierkegaard in either or describes as the highest form of pleasure because it stimulates the imagination. What is distinctive of the aesthetic is that it is personal and private. The ethical operates towards the amelioration of the universal. The ethical is always disclosed, it's never kept secretive, it maximizes the common good. If we'd like to oppose the ethical to the aesthetic, we'd say that the aesthetic is directed towards the self, while the ethical is directed towards society and by extension the entirety of humanity. The troubled man who ponders about Abraham's story cannot make sense of it. He is using reason, and reason is incapable of unpacking what really happened with Abraham. If anything, reason would paint Abraham as a murderer. It is because Abraham is not a tragic hero. He is what Johannes calls a knight of faith. The Eulogy of Abraham. In the Eulogy of Abraham, Johannes starts by speaking about how poetry immortalizes the tragic hero. The tragic hero is applauded and held in high esteem because he chooses resignation from everything that benefits him for the greatest good. He is the ethical hero. Then Johannes evokes Abraham's ordeal. Abraham sacrifices a lot too. He has been asked to leave his native land, and he did. He was told he would have a son, but he was growing older and wasn't having any sons. Yet Abraham never lost faith in what God told him. And not before becoming very old, Abraham did get a son. Then God asked Abraham to kill his long-awaited son, and Abraham unhesitatingly set off to do that. When God commanded Abraham to kill his son, Abraham didn't try to bargain with God. He didn't manifest the smallest discontent. An ethical hero would have offered his life instead of his son's. But Abraham is not an ethical hero, he's a class above. According to Kierkegaard, Abraham is a knight of faith. The knight of faith experiences resignation because he resigns from what brings him satisfaction and comfort. The tragic hero does that too, but the knight of faith resigns also from what brings comfort to his reason. He doesn't take the course of action that rationally brings the greatest good to the world. The knight of faith is in an intimate connection with the absolute. And this type of connection is impossible to understand through reason. Johannes insists that there are no words that, if strung together, could describe the mental state of the knight of faith and his connection with God. All we can do is peek at it. The knight of faith's actions are different from the tragic hero's because they are not understandable through reason. Based on reason, Abraham's actions make him a murderer. If Abraham were a tragic hero, one who acts based on what is ethical, he would have offered to sacrifice his life instead of his son's, and he would have been eulogized by poets and playwrights. However, the knight of faith is not understood. In Expectoration, Johannes says that what Abraham does is a movement of faith. And the movement of faith requires the undertaking of an absurd action. By absurd, Johannes means something that is not understandable by reason. Then this absurd action evolves into a leap of faith. It is a moment where the knight of faith brackets the ethical and abandons himself to what God wills. A step is different from a leap, When we make a step, we always have one foot touching the ground, but when we leap during a single moment, we are suspended in the air, in the unknown. It could be scary, but we land well, and Abraham did land well. In fact, he regained his son through repetition. The concept of repetition is so important for Kierkegaard that he has a book entitled Repetition. So what is this repetition? It is the process of undertaking an absurd action that leads to abandoning what you cherish the most, only for you to regain an improved version of it. We can contrast three doctrines about how humanity moves forward: Plato's concept of recollection, Hegel's mediation through dialectics, and Kierkegaard's repetition. Plato tells us that there are pure forms of everything we know. According to Plato, our souls are immortal, and in a previous life we had access to the essences of things, we had access to the forms. So in this life, all matter of discovery is but a matter of recollection. Hegel's mediation is the idea that we move forward by the continuous juxtaposition of a thesis and its antithesis that yields us a thesis that itself becomes another thesis, that we friction with an antithesis. Kierkegaard holds that it is the process of repetition that ameliorates what we have. Problema I posits the question of whether there is any telos that ensues from the bracketing of the ethical. Now, telos is a purpose or an end game. It is clear that the Knight of Faith performs a suspension or an epoche of the ethical. The ethical requires sacrificing one's own interests for the many. The Knight of Faith acts in a way that is contrary to the ethical. But the question is why? What is gained from doing that? Hegel would say that nothing is gained from acting contrary to the ethical. Kierkegaard says that there is a lot that the Knight of Faith gains. Kierkegaard says that through the process of repetition, he gains a better version of what he was ready to lose. Abraham's relationship with his son is changed forever after God relieves him from killing Isaac in the last moment. The other thing the Knight of Faith gains is the chance to address God by thou, the informal second person singular you. This refers to a proximity with God that no one else reaches. In Problema II, Kierkegaard refers to a paradox warranted by a distinction that Hegel makes. For Hegel, the aesthetic is turned towards the inner because the person cares only about himself and his pleasure. The ethical is turned towards the outer, the universal. The paradox is that faith has elements of both the aesthetic and the ethical. It is turned towards the inner because the Knight of Faith internally experiences a connection with the absolute. There is nothing that accounts for this connection in the outer world. Yet, at the same time, God is not contained in the body of the Knight of Faith. God is the ultimate universal. In Problema III, Kierkegaard questions whether Abraham was right in not telling his wife and his son the truth, that he was commanded by God to kill Isaac as a sacrificial offering. Again, hiding and concealing are things that are associated with the aesthetic. The person seeks only one's own interest, and in his endeavour to serve his interest, he conceals things. But in the ethical, there is full disclosure. In fact, it is through disclosure that poets and playwrights and people's memories immortalize the tragic hero. Disclosure is honesty. The ethical hero, or the tragic hero, doesn't compromise on honesty. So in appearance, it seems that both the aesthetic hero and the Knight of Faith hide things, while the ethical hero discloses everything. But there is a vital difference between the aesthetic hero and the Knight of Faith, and it is that the aesthetic hero chooses not to disclose to serve some personal purpose or to save a loved one, while the Knight of Faith is obliged to keep silent because there is no way he would be understood. By disclosing, he would only create more confusion. In this third problema, Johannes argues, using many examples from history, to show that the Knight of Faith is sometimes obliged to withdraw from the universal and to bracket its influence. The picture that Kierkegaard paints of the world is one that is disturbing. Kierkegaard tells us that there is no independent moral algorithm, something like Kant's categorical imperative, and that is capable of guiding our actions and our thoughts. If that were the case, Abraham would have been considered a murderer, but he is not. On the contrary, Abraham is eulogized as the father of faith. This means that God might want us to do things that, according to man's morality, are horrible, and yet it would be the right thing to do. We are always free to choose what type of life we want to live. We're free to choose to be the aesthetic hero or the moral hero, as Kierkegaard has indicated in Either Or. And with Fear and Trembling, there is a third choice. Be in the night of faith, and it is the hardest of all. Now this video has reached its end. Until we meet again, have a great day.